Welcome to Let's Talk with Tara, the space where real life meets real answers. I am Dr. Tara T. Stallings, counselor and coach, here to help you navigate life's toughest challenges. Together, we'll explore psychological insights, emotional healing, relational growth, and biblical truths to empower your journey. So grab a seat, lean in, and let's have the conversations that matter the most. Welcome, I am Dr. Tara T. Stallings, and we are starting a new series. We're talking about personal cycles. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding sexual behavior in a cycle. Could the way that you view sex and intimacy be rooted in past pain rather than your present desire? Have you ever asked yourself why you make certain sexual choices, even when they don't align with your values, your desires? Or could it be that your current sexual behaviors aren't just about desire, but are connected to a deeper emotional, spiritual, and or generational patterns? Let's talk about it today. Understanding the cycle of sexual behavior. Most of you guys know that I'm a therapist, I'm a life coach, I work in the ministry. So I encounter so many different people on a day-to-day basis. And I thought it would be great, informative to share this information about when we're talking about personal cycles to get a better understanding when it comes to sexual behavior. From, I guess, a cultural perspective, my sex has been early on a taboo. Now we look at sex now, it's been glamorized, it's been promoted and perverted from its intended meaning and actuality of what sex, the behavior sex is, and also it has been dumbed down. I'm going to say dumbed down in the understanding that sex is not just sex. That when you encounter, when you have sexual behaviors, when you have sexual intercourse, that it's not just the behavior, that sex is dimensional. Yes, it's physical. Yes, it's emotional. Mind, body, soul, emotion, soul ties. But it is also spiritual. And the unhealthy cycle with sex impacts every dimension. It impacts every dimension. So today I want to just touch the surface today. I'm going to talk about this in depth a little later on in these series. But today I want to touch the surface on understanding the cycle of sexual behavior. So I have a lot of notes that I want you guys to take some copious notes. And I want to take my time to kind of dissect this and give you this information so that maybe you can get a better understanding that sex is not just sex. It's not just a feeling. It's not just a desire. It's rooted in so many different areas in your life, and it impacts so many different areas in your life. This pattern, sexual patterns are rarely about just the physical desire alone. Rarely. It's often rooted in emotional need, psychological conditioning, or spiritual confusion. Now, that spiritual confusion, that's a whole nother topic, a whole nother two segments in itself, but I'm going to touch on it, a little bit. So when we talk about the psychological effects of repetitive sexual behaviors. So I guess you say, well, what are sexual behaviors? Having multiple partners, masturbation, the desire for pornography, to watch pornography, um, desires that are addictive, So let's talk about the psychological effects of the repetitive, because people use sex in so many different ways. Um, when I say masturbation, people say, "Well, what's wrong with masturbation?" It's a lot is wrong with masturbation because of the psychological effect it can cause. What's wrong with having multiple partners? Well, there's a multiple things that are connected with having multiple partners, especially when we talk about soul ties, psychological effects. So let's talk about it a little bit. I want to take my time, but I don't want to be on too long, but I do want to share with you. Let's talk about reinforcement of coping mechanisms. So many people use sex as a coping mechanism. And I'm going to raise my hand because I'm guilty. I was guilty of this at one time in my life. I used it as a coping mechanism. I use sex as a coping mechanism. I use sex to be manipulative. But I used it because I got introduced to sexual activity, and it caused a reinforcement. I had a lot of patterns, but we're going to talk about this one today. We're going to talk about this one today. But sexual activity can act like a psychological high, meaning it can triggering dopamine and oxytocin. I always mess that word up. That mimic emotional closeness and pleasure. So it acts like an emotional high. When you use this sexual behavior repetitively to cope with stress, trauma, or rejection, it becomes a conditional habit. Meaning, I feel bad. Mindset is, well, sex makes me feel better. How many of you guys can relate to that? You feel bad, let me have some sex, I'll feel better. Or let me masturbate and I'll feel better. Let me watch some porn and I'll feel better. And over time, this reinforces an unhealthy loop of emotional numbing and avoidance. What does it look like? Someone who feels unworthy after a breakup may engage in casual sex, not because of the desire, but to numb the rejection, to make them feel better. Get it? Feel better. It becomes a psychological escape route. And so many men and women use sex as a psychological escape route. You see them in and out of one relationship. By the time they're out of one relationship today, and 2 days later, they're in a whole nother relationship calling somebody babe. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You were just in love with somebody else 2 days ago. It's not about the intimacy. It's not about the connection. It's about the psychological conundrum that person uses to relieve stress, trauma, or rejection, to feel better. The sex is not just about the desire, it's to make them feel better emotionally. To feel better emotionally. And then let's talk about identity, confusion, and fragmentation. When someone's sense of self-worth becomes linked to how sexually desired or active they are, they struggle with their self-worth when they're not in a relationship. You see men and women, they have to be in a relationship. it's like, how do you just, they go from one relationship to another, because guess what? Their identity, they're fragmented and they're confused. So they use sex to fill that gap of making them their self-worth, making them feel worthy of themselves. This repetitive behavior in this area can lead to internal conflict. Knowing what knowing you want more emotionally or spiritually, but feeling stuck in this pattern. So what does this look like? Well, you're tired of having going through woman after woman after woman. You're tired of having different men in relationships. You're tired of being in different relationships. You've had 20 different men, and they all live with you. You're tired of it. You're tired of being stuck there, but you don't know how to get out of it. You don't know what to do next because you've been doing it so long. You don't know how to change the cycle, the conundrum. The symptoms look like low self-esteem. I see it every day. Low self-esteem. When they're not receiving sexual attention, low self-esteem, depression, anxiety sets in. What does this look like? And I know people like this. I know people. When they're not in a relationship, when it's not sex involved, and they don't have anybody around, they become depressed. They become detached. They have anxiety. They look for uh, um, they look for validation in people, in sex, and being in that relationship. And it's not just about the relationship, just being in a relationship. It's what the sex part of that relationship brings to them. They have difficulty seeing value outside of their physical appearance. Now, sometimes they don't care about their physical appearance, but it's about their sexual performance. You may see them and like, oh my gosh, you don't look kept, you don't look clean. But to them, it's not about how their outside appearance. It's about how they perform. And you will hear them say things, you know. I don't want to be vulgar here, but they will say things regarding about their sexual performance and how good they are. And that's the only thing that they can validate themselves with is my cat is good. I know it's good. I can make you do this and I can make you this, or their pee is good and I can make you do this. And that's their only value. That's the only value that they bring. And they find people like themselves to connect with, and they're both in that cycle. They both find themselves in this conundrum, in this sexual cycle. They have mental fog. They're indecisive. They have an inability to emotionally detach from their sexual partners. So once the partner is gone, emotionally, they still thinking about that person. They still remembering this person. They still thinking about it when they're with another partner. So they have a mental fog. They have a mental fog. So let's talk about, we talked about the psychological effects. So what are some of the emotional effects of sexual behaviors in a cycle? Well, the most common one is guilt and shame. Guilt and shame. Many people experience deep regret after sexual encounters that don't align with their values or spiritual beliefs. Now, listen, when I was struggling with this, I wasn't a believer. Let me just say that I was not a believer. And I would convince myself, even though I felt bad, I would convince myself, it's just, I was biggity. I would convince myself that, even though this is not what I wanted, I got that high from it because I was masking something else. But I would still continue to do it. And I would kind of lie. Well, it wasn't kind of, I lied to myself about how I felt afterwards. so that I wouldn't feel the guilt and the shame. So that I wouldn't feel, I would block it out. Well, just I would use certain words or certain unhealthy beliefs about sex so that I would be able to realign myself with the next partner. With the next partner. This shame often led or leads to self-condemnation and further secrecy, reinforcing the cycle. So you feel shame, you feel guilty, but you know what? You kind of brush it off. Let me find somebody else so I don't have to deal with the guilt and the shame. let me do that so you don't have to deal with the guilt and the shame of it. And it becomes a sexual cycle. It's a cycle that's unhealthy. Now, here's an example. A one-night stand with an individual feels after one-night stand with an individual, you feel worthless and ashamed. And this not just for women, because I have men that come sit in my chairs, and because women just think that men are just, they're all the same, but men have these sexual encounters, and after they have it, it's a release for them, but they don't feel emotionally, it's a void. So they feel worthless, they feel ashamed, there's regret, and rather than them seeking processing it or seeking healing, they internalize the shame and they seek another partner so that you can numb that feeling of guilt and shame. Let me find somebody else so I don't have to feel this. It becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle. Emotional detachment or dependency. Some cope by becoming emotionally numb, detaching from partners, or avoiding vulnerability altogether. And then others become emotional dependent, clinging to anyone who gives them a temporary intimacy. So it looks like the behavior looks like, well, they just they're there. They will go through the motions. They go through the act, but they're numb. They're avoiding, you know, they're with their partner, but they emotionally they're detached to their partner. They've learned how to mimic that behavior, but emotionally they are detached. The emotional impact of this is the loss of trust in yourself and others. That's where you have people say, I got trust issues. Well, this sexual behavior cause you to have trust issues. You don't trust yourself, you don't trust others. It's difficulty establishing emotional boundaries. You have difficulty creating boundaries emotional with not just sexual partners, but with people in general, because your emotions are so in array. You feel either too much or not enough. You see those people that's hypersensitive, or they're just numb, they're not feeling enough. In every romantic connection, you hear people say, well, you're just not emotionally attached. Have you heard that? People say, well, sex, they're just not emotionally available. This has to do with sex. Sex can cause people to be unavailable emotionally. That's the emotional impact of it. Because sex is never about just the behavior of sex. And then we talked about it a little bit, anxiety, depression, and loneliness. This cycle of sexual highs followed by emotional lows can mimic the pattern of emotional withdrawal, similar to addiction. Similar to addiction. When they don't have a relationship, or anybody to call on, a booty call, they're down low. You don't see them, they're going through the depression. I just don't feel, they have no motivation. These are cycles. Feelings of being used, disconnected, or trapped in a pattern can lead to chronic sadness or anxiety. This is what this stuff leads to. Loneliness deepens when sex is used as a substitute for real connection and emotional intimacy. Now, that one I hear all the time. I just feel lonely. I don't have anyone. And then they're depressed because they feel lonely because it's the sex part is not there, because they use sex as a substitute for a real connection. So when they get with somebody, they think, oh, if I have sex with this person, I'm going to have a connection with this person, and not so much. And then a lot of times they have sex with the person, and it's like a hit, a high. They got a desire met, a physical desire met, an emotional desire met. But once it's met, it's like, okay, this is not what I wanted. The high, they come down off the high, and then they realize, I don't think I want this. Or they say, well, I don't want this is all I have right now, so I'm gonna stick with it until I get something that I really want. And it becomes a cycle. It becomes a cycle. So let's talk about the spiritual effects, because I don't want to be here too long. And I think I'm going to have to come back and talk about these soul ties, because there's so much to talk about when we talk about soul ties. So the spiritual effects is the disconnection with God and inner peace, unhealthy soul ties. So what are soul ties? Soul ties are sexual connections from spiritual and emotional bonds, even if no relationship is present. These ties can cloud decision making, emotional health, and the ability to move on. Soul ties are deep emotional, spiritual bonds formed between individuals, often through sexual intimacy. Not now, because we're talking about sex, but soul ties can be created outside of sex, but also through intense emotional experiences. While the Bible doesn't use the phrase soul ties specifically, it clearly points to the concept in the verse in Genesis: the two shall become one flesh. The two shall become one flesh. You create soul ties when you have sex with people. The more you have sex, the more you create a stronger soul tie. Sex is never about just sex. Now, can soul ties don't have to, when we talk about soul ties, they don't necessarily have to be bad, but we're talking about it from a perspective of sex right now. And what does this look like? Well, someone's trying to move forward in their life, but they cannot stop thinking about or having an emotional reaction about a former partner years later. And what happens with these soul ties is this: because it's a soul tie, it's an entanglement. Soul ties, um, it's a covenant. That's what it is. It's a covenant, and it creates confusion, emotional entanglement, and spiritual unrest. And when it does that, when we talk about soul ties, when you have sexual encounters with partners, when you create a soul tie, you're tied to whatever unhealthy, dangerous, demonic mindset, demons, generational curses that's tied to that person, because the two are becoming one. The more you get together, the more you become. And the more tied you get to their craziness. Let me put it that way. The more tied you get to their craziness, and the craziness in their bloodline and in their families. And guess what? It's 10, 15 years later, and you don't know why you acting the way you act. You don't know why you feeling like you feeling. You don't know why you have those so-called wet dreams at night. Because you got spiritual soul ties Perversion. That's a lot to talk about. We're not gonna talk about that now because I only have about about 10 more minutes. So let's talk about. But we need to talk about these soul ties. These soul ties, they fragment your soul. They fragment your soul, and so now you got to deal with your cycles and their cycles. So you're dealing with your cycles that you don't know you have. You're dealing with all your 10, 15, 20 partner cycles and all of their cycles, the cycles that they had. And now you don't know why you bound up in depression, anxiety, suicide, anger, lust, addiction. You don't know why you're dealing with all of that stuff because you tied up with so many things. The cycle, and you're in this conundrum, this cycle that's gonna keep repeating itself. And what it does is, it's not all the time. It comes in waves. It comes in waves. It'll come in waves. You get yourself together, and here it comes again, in an attack from all different angles in your life. Different angles. Different angles. So we have to be mindful when we talk about soul ties. There are psychological effects of soul ties. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to have to talk about this a little bit more in depth. But I want to give you a good running start when we're talking about personal cycles. And we're going to talk about later how to break these cycles at the end of this series, because it's so much information. And I think for those who need it, that don't understand that sex is not just sex. Sex is not just the behavior. It impacts you physically. It impacts you spiritually. And it impacts you in your mind, psychologically, and your emotions. And a lot of the reasons that you're dealing with depression, anxiety, your bad cycle with relationships is because you have some soul ties, some patterns, some cycles that you have not identified, that you need to identify so that you can break the pattern off of your life. And once you break the pattern off of your life, you will be free from the attachment from these soul ties. Because we have not been taught that this sexual behaviors, sexual entanglements, sexual interactions, they are not just physical. They impact every area of your life. And when you see yourself, 10, 15, 20 years later, from one encounter with a crazy, you didn't know he was full of demons. You didn't know that they came for crazy because you were in this relationship and you thought you were so in love, and then y'all broke up. And it's been 20 years ago, but now you dealing with depression, or you dealing with anger, and you've never dealt with that before because you got a soul tie that you never broke off. That's a cycle, has access to you. It has access to you. And again, and it comes in waves. And we're never taught these things. We are never taught the understanding because of sex and these cycles from a sexual behavior perspective, because we don't really understand that we are a spirit, we have a soul, and we live in a body. So everything we do it from a three-dimensional standpoint. It's not just sex to behavior. No, it's sex to behavior that can cause some physical responses, but it's sex, in the soul tie that ties you to it, that ties you to it, and then it impacts your spirit because you are a spirit. The emotional in the soul is your mind, your emotions, your will, and it impacts it tremendously because we've never been taught these things. Never been taught these things. We've been taught, oh, it's just sex. Everybody does it. And everybody does it. And everybody that's doing it, and that's not doing it the way it was intended to be, caught up with all kind of sexual partners, infidelity, adultery, fornication, you don't realize the cycle that was created because of sex. And then, because remember now, we were born in sin, shaped in iniquity. Until you become born again, you got cycles that's in your generations, and we talked about it a little bit, that's in your bloodline that you don't even know. You don't even know that's going on. You know, we say the big controversy when we talk about homosexuality and lesbianism, well, you know, years ago they threw out, well, are people born that way? And I'm going to say, yeah, they are. Because you're born in sin, shaped in iniquity. And what I mean by they're born that way, they're born with the propensity to be attached to or attracted to certain things because of the perversion that's in their families. And we think perversion is, oh, was somebody else that way? No, it could have been your mama, your grandmama, great grandmama was kind of out there. She got 5 husbands and she never been married. Guess what? That's why you got all this sexual immorality running through your family line. You got all that sexual immorality. And guess what? In each generation, it grows, and it transforms to and transmutates to other things. So we have to be mindful of that. So guys, I've stayed too long. I'm going to come back and talk about that later. So when we talk about sexual behaviors, understanding our personal cycles and sexual behaviors, sexual brokenness is not your identity. So if you've been dealing with some unhealthy sexual cycles, depression, anxiety, feeling lonely, feeling rejected, and going through that high, and feeling like maybe you have some soul ties, I want you to comment on this video. I want you to comment on this video because I'm definitely going to come back and I'm going to talk, and I will definitely address some of your questions if you have questions when I address this again. So as I close today, I want you to remember this. Every cycle has a root, and every root can be healed through identification and through truth. Whoever tends the garden controls the fruit. I'm going to say that again. Whoever tends the garden controls your fruit. I'll see you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in to Let's Talk with Tom. If you found today's conversation helpful, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Let's keep this dialogue going. Follow me on Let's Talk for more insights and encouragement. Remember, every step forward starts with an honest conversation. Until next time, stay grounded, stay growing, and keep talking.